Shalom. My name is Denny Thompson. Welcome to this, our 11th edition of Contextual Bible Study. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for the words and truth and richness of Scripture that we can examine. Today, as we look at this very famous Psalm, Psalm 23, may everything that we learn in terms of the background, in terms of the truth, be for your honor and glory. Amen. Now, as we get into this study today, this very, very famous psalm that everyone's familiar with, I first want to look at this idea here that you've heard of before, this idea of the land of milk and honey. And what does that have to do with today's lesson? Well, the land of milk, as we're going to see, represented the land of the shepherd, and the land of honey represent the land of the farmer. Now let's look a little more specifically here. On this map, you can see the Dead Sea to the right, and the yellow area, the area of the shepherds, and to the left of that, the area of the farmers. So the farmer area was on the hills, in the hillside of Judea, and the shepherding area was this very dry, desolate, even mountainous wilderness area. That's where that area would be. So when we talk about the land of the shepherd and farmer, we're talking about both of these regions. To a little more specifically, the land of honey represented the land of the farmer because honey was illustrated by the Hebrew word debash, which means gummy or sticky, but it's in reference to actual honey. And it's in reference to sweeteners gained from or honey from grapes, dates, or figs. So those would all be grown in that hillside, up in the Judean hillside mountains. And in the land of milk was the land of the shepherds. Specifically referred to goat's milk because that was richer than the milk from sheep. 40% more production than sheep, 35% more butter fat, and it was very ideal for yogurts and cheeses, which were used even back in those days. So, if we look at the map again, we can say the land of milk is the land of the shepherds, of course, and the land of honey is the land of the farmer. So that's what those words mean when we hear those in the Bible. That's what it's referring to. Now, the idea of shepherding in the Bible is everywhere. It's just a rich idea it's throughout the scriptures, from Old Testament to New. And even in the catacombs, which was in Rome, we can see images like this right here, image of a shepherd, because it was so famous and so well known even back in those days. Now, the Hebrew word for God, the simple word is El, the longer version is Elohim. When we look at it in terms of the Hebrew letters, remember I mentioned before that Hebrew is like a picture language, at least initially it was. And Hebrew does go from right to left. So if we look at the simple term El for God, we look at the idea of the Lamed, which is what the El is. The Lamed actually is a shepherd's staff. That's actually what it was because these are pictures. And the El would be the Aleph, which was represented by the ox head, the first head of the strong. So God's name in terms of picture languages, the Hebrew picture, is simply the shepherd, the head shepherd, the strong shepherd, the first shepherd, the one in charge. Now, Jesus said this when he was looking at the vast numbers of people following him at different times, many of them asking to be healed. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. So this image is at the heart of Jesus' teachings, this whole concept of sheep. In this case, sheep without a shepherd, because so many of these people were so needy and so much need. Now, so why are we looking at Psalm 23? Why is that so important? Because sheep are representative of people, of us, in the scriptures. It's kind of like a metaphor. In verses like this, we all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way. Isaiah 53:6. Now, in those days, in the New Testament time period and earlier, about 90% of the people worked the land, and a pretty substantial number of them were shepherds, especially early on in the Old Testament time period. Sheep have a tendency to be very impulsive. They often react before they think. Sometimes they make bad decisions because they're being so reactive, leading them into very vulnerable, difficult situations. And sheep are subject to all kinds of problems, like ticks, diseases, and they require a whole lot of care. So the shepherd has his hands full taking care of his sheep. There's a lot to look out for here. Now, throughout Israel's history, shepherds were held in high esteem, especially in the Old Testament time period. Leaders like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob were shepherds, and many others throughout the scriptures. Before Moses shepherded the sheep of Israel to the promised land, he first tended sheep. So we can see that how elevated this position was, even in terms of the leaders of Israel. But there was a huge influence during New Testament time period of this Greek-Roman world that kind of came into Israel from various angles there. And in the case in Jesus' day, shepherding is not looked at as a high occupation whatsoever. In fact, shepherds were considered to be thieves, grazing on other people's lands. They were hated by the religious authorities. They were considered unclean and banned from the temple by the same group. So you can see things changed greatly. They got very, very influenced by these Greek-Roman ideas of demonization of manual labor. The word pastor is actually a Latin term, which means shepherd. So be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, from 1 Peter as a verse referring to this idea of a pastor. And there's a lot of references in the Bible to bad shepherds. Ezekiel 34 has several references. There are many other places also. The bad shepherds, of course, were the leaders of Israel who were not doing their job. Now, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, he will sit on his throne in heavenly glory. He will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates his sheep from the goats. Now, I'm just going to look at this very briefly here to kind of indicate what is this about, and then we're going to get directly into Psalms 23. But the arrow is pointing to a goat, and there are a few goats among the sheep. So why is this pointed out here? Why is this idea of separating sheep from goats? What's the difference? Here's a combination. This is in Israel of sheep and goats grazing in the same area. Sometimes this can lead to really big problems. And the reason is goats are prone to wander. It's very hard for the shepherd to kind of corral them in and get them to follow them all the time because they're very individualistic and they like to do their own thing. And sometimes sheep will follow the goats. So in this verse we were referring to before, Jesus was referring to, he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Now this is of course symbolic, but for those who decide to go their own way like goats, they're going to be on the left and the sheep on the right. Now what is this left versus right idea in the Bible? Well, obviously it's symbolism. It's not literal. Doesn't mean that people who are left-handed are in any way lesser or whatever. But the idea of the left hand in the Bible is often associated with symbols of weakness, deception, or even evil. The heart of the wise inclines to the right, but the heart of the fool to the left. Now there's one example of one verse that's using this idea. Another verse, for your God holds your right hand. It is I who say to you, fear not, I am the one who helps you. So there we can see the right hand idea. So this whole idea of separation of right and left, sheep and goats, kind of goes back to that idea. Now let's get into Psalms 23, and I'm going to use the King James Version because it's the most familiar, and I think it's done very well. So the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So let's take a look at this famous psalm, and we're going to kind of slow it down here, look at it right in order, a section at a time, and see if we can draw some insights based on some context. So it begins, of course, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Okay, so the setting here is where the shepherds are, the land of the shepherd, the wilderness. So that's the setting for this particular psalm. It's going to be in the wilderness. Shepherds had to be very, very talented. It wasn't just a case of leading a bunch of sheep around. They had to know all kinds of things. They had to be a veterinarian in a sense. They had to examine their sheep and see if they were sick or what needs to be done, and even try to help them in certain situations. They had to be a botanist in terms of understanding plants and grasses, exactly what could be eaten and what could not be eaten, where certain things are found. A geologist in terms of rock structures, in terms of directing water flows. A meteorologist in terms of checking out the weather and make sure they know what was going to be happening. And a hydrologist to understand where the water is, which is like one of the toughest things in the wilderness. So it's kind of like a farmer today. They have to know so many things. That's the way it was with shepherds. Had to be a master of many, many trades. It was a very difficult job, and it was very comprehensive. Now, great danger in the wilderness, obviously. There were challenges everywhere. The heat, the landscape, robbers, preying animals. David committing himself to the protection of the Lord. No sheep is ever taken out to pasture alone, always a group. So when he refers to my shepherd, that's what he's referring to. This group, this whole idea, never separated, always together as a group. Understanding these great difficulties and dangers that exist in this setting for this Psalm 23. Now, he maketh me lie down in green pastures. Now, we might have an image like this. This is actually northern Israel. A few sessions ago, I did a teaching about upon this rock, Caesarea Philippi, way in the north, and there's a city, Dan, right next to it. That's where this picture is taken from. This is a very luscious, green, fertile area of Israel where water is plentiful. And we might have this kind of an image of green pastures, okay? That, I think, typically is what we think, the types of green pastures in Psalm 23. But that's not the image in the wilderness, not at all. From March to November, where there's not a drop of rain anywhere in Israel, the desert is extremely difficult to find any evidence of green grass. This is a picture of the desert, of the wilderness or desert. Those words are used interchangeably during that time period. So how in the world would you find grass there for your sheep? That's pretty difficult. From December to March, where there is some rains, even in the wilderness, a little bit of rain, there's a little bit of a green hue that starts to show up here, and you can see it if you look along the hillsides there. You can see evidence of some grasses showing up. So that part of the year is going to be obviously easier than the other time of the year for the shepherd. But not all the grass is good to eat. Some can cause nausea. Some grass is even toxic of the little bit of grass that even exists. The shepherd leads his sheep to the good green pastures. So this is a job, trying to find really good green grass to feed his sheep. So David's image here is really quite complicated. It's not that simple. It's very hard to find these green pastures. Most of the year, the green pastures are nothing more than little tufts of grass, just enough for that day. So in other words, if we look close in the desert, there's just tiny little tufts of grass that the sheep have to rely on, and that's it. So most of the year, it's not like there's grass everywhere. It's just enough for that day. So it's like an image. And of course, we are representative. The sheep are representative of us, so that would be representative of our lives. that, and I know in our United States, because of the affluence of our country, it's hard to kind of get a handle on that. But that's the image in the Bible of just enough. God will provide just enough to get me through that day. Sheep are inclined to overgraze. They tend to overeat, especially when they're see an area that looks pretty good. They will overgraze. Sometimes they even eat out the roots. Shepherds have to be very careful of this because if they tear out the roots of where that sparse grass is even found, the shepherd won't be able to go back to there on another occasion. There won't be any more grass because they've torn the roots out. So he has to watch that close, and he has to keep moving them that they don't destroy the pasture land to be used in the future. When no green grass is available, shepherds will cut leafy greens from a little bush or a tree and then hand feed their sheep. They have to do whatever they need to do to keep their sheep sustained. Now, this whole idea of he leadeth me besides the still waters. First of all, we'll look at still waters, but first look at leadeth me. What does that mean? Well, shepherds lead. They don't drive their sheep. They're always in front. Okay? And they will lead their sheep either by playing a pipe, a little musical pipe, kind of like a flute, making certain tunes that the sheep become very familiar with, or they sing. They have a little song they sing that the sheep get familiar with that. And so they get familiar with their shepherd's songs, either his music or his singing, and they follow because they have very good hearing. Sheep have very excellent hearing. They don't have great sight. So that's very significant. Everything is based on hearing. They plan a day around the availability of food and water, of course, the shepherd does, as he moves his sheep around. Now, a verse in the New Testament from Jesus who said, "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me." Now, clearly he's drawing this exactly from how this works, how sheep operate and how they listen to their shepherd. They want to be able to hear the voice of the shepherd. And of course, to apply that to us today, in order to know the voice of Jesus, we have to know his words, know his teaching, to recognize them. We know that that's really his teaching, not some false teaching. And we can only do that as we study his word. And of course, that's what he wants us to do, to understand his voice, to hear it clearly. This verse from Isaiah, "I will signal for them and gather them in. He whistles for those at the ends of the earth. Here they come swiftly and speedily." So this is the idea of blowing that whistle or blowing that little flute, and sheep will come running. They will hear that. Interesting little story here I just inserted. I had read this and I thought you might be interested. And this happened in the 1930s in what was called Palestine, because it was called Palestine until 1948. The Romans had renamed it, if you remember that story a long time ago, Syria, Palestina, and so shortened to Palestine. But anyway, the British were in control during that time period. And a lot of times the British were not real great. They treated the people not so good. And they did some things that were really inexcusable. There was a little village near Haifa, a big seaport in Israel, that was being condemned by the British to this collective punishment. They were upset with the Jews who lived in that area. So those who were shepherds, they took their sheep and cattle, for the case those are farmers, and they were sequestered by the government. So they just took away their livelihoods, what they did. Eventually, the Jews could redeem their animals at a price. Now, among the people the farmers and the shepherds who had their animals taken, was an orphan shepherd boy whose only possession were 6 sheep. They had been taken. That's all he had. Somehow, he obtained the money for their redemption. So here he comes with money to go to this big area where all these animals are confined. He went into this massive enclosure where there are thousands of animals. They were penned. He offered his money to the British commander in charge. He was told, "You can take 6 sheep." But he was ridiculed when he said he wanted his own sheep back, because they said, "You can't, how do you know it's your own sheep, who they even are? Impossible." The little shepherd boy knew better. He knew a lot better than they did. He had his shepherd's pipe with him, this little flute, and he blew it. And believe it or not, out of those massive numbers of animals, his 6 sheep eventually wandered their way around the corners of these animals and worked their way out right up next to this little boy. I think that commander was amazed. This is representative of how the sheep know the shepherd's voice, or in this case, his sound, his flute. Now, he leadeth me beside the still waters. Now, I want to examine this idea of still waters because it's very, very important. Now, water in the wilderness is obviously a bit of a challenge, to say the least. So that in itself is really difficult. The shepherd had to plan very carefully. Part of the year, the sheep were able to actually get some dew off the grasses in the morning, and the shepherd knew exactly when that was. That was not going to sustain him, but that was one source of water. Another source, which is not common at all in the desert, are wells. And there were a few, but few and far between. So that would be very, very rare to be able to find a well. And that was great if a shepherd had one, but he could not rely on them. Another one is cisterns. Now, cisterns are areas where the shepherds could collect water and pour it into this area. It's just going to be just still and stagnant. And over time, it's not great water because it gets things in it. It's warm. It's not great, but at least it's water. So there are many of these cisterns all over the wilderness that the shepherds had set up. Now, this idea of still water. Okay, what's that about? Well, if the shepherd did find any moving water, and that would only be the case of these wadis after the rains, or if they're way down in Gedi, but any source of moving water, the sheep wanted nothing to do with it. Why? What was the deal with that? Why were they afraid of moving water? Now, if you examine these sheep and you look at the thickness of their wool, the thickest part of their wool is right here. It's right beneath from their head on down. That area right there is extremely thick. So what does that have to do with this still waters and water? Why? This has to do with why they are afraid of moving water. They don't want to be by moving water. Because when they get by moving water and they bend down to drink, that area of the wool can get saturated and literally pull their head into the water. So they had to be very cautious about this. And in order to get into that moving water, they would have had to bend way down. So the remedy was something like this. This is kind of cool. You can see this where that heavy wool is not going to get in the way of their drinking. They can get to the water just fine. And that would be what still water was like to them. Still water was safe. It was not where they felt threatened. And they did feel threatened with moving water because they were going to get this tendency. They knew they might drown if they tried to drink this stuff. So the shepherd had to deal with this all the time. He had to figure this out. How do I get even when I find moving water, how do I make it so that my sheep can drink? Now, this is like a little natural pool in the wilderness, one of the rare ones. That would be an area where would be fine. The sheep would feel very comfortable with something like that. And you would also find this is a wadi, one of these deep canyons. Created from rainfall in the mountains of the center part of the country. And there's still some water left, so it's during that time period after some rains, and yet it's not a dangerous time period. But sometimes what the shepherd would do is he would prepare pools. Now, it's a little hard to see, but to the right of that, where it says prepared pools, you can see that carved out area. These are actually carved out areas that the shepherd has made, so they're like cisterns. So they would make these near these temporary rivers that would be found in the wilderness, these prepared pools. Now, he maketh me lie down in green pastures, but sheep would only lie down after they had enough food and water. Apart from that, they were restless. So this whole idea of lying down in green pastures would only happen after the shepherd had found enough food and water for his sheep. Next, he restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Now, I've mentioned this before, and I will be again because I think this is so important. This idea of the path of righteousness was also called the shepherd's path. It was a path that the shepherd knew would lead to water and to food. And you can see these, as I've mentioned before, these other pathways that the sheep have veered off from the shepherd's path. And maybe they saw what they thought was green grass or whatever they saw, and they got off the pathway and they started going on down on their own way. And these happen to be the two words for sin in Hebrew, both relate to these twisted paths. Avon and Shatah, the two Hebrew words. All we like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way. Now, this is literally a picture of that verse, literally. So how does this happen? Well, when the sheep stop listening to their shepherd and they use their poor vision, poor eyesight, which is not nearly as sharp as their hearing, to determine which way they're going to go. So you can see the application of this to us clearly. When we are not listening to the words of Jesus, what he's saying, and we go off our own way, the further we go off our own way, the more danger we're in, just as they are. So this literally is an image, not just this verse, it's literally a picture of the verse. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Now, this is often cited at funerals, in situations like that, for comfort. What does it mean in terms of context? Well, the valley of the shadow of death, let's go back to these wadis again. Now, if you're walking up on top in the wilderness area, in the desert, it's very, very bright sun. It's just brilliant sun. And if you've ever been in a bright sun for a period of time, it can be almost blinding to you. You kind of, you can't, unless you have really good sunglasses on, you maybe can't see that great. And when you're coming upon maybe a cliff or something, it's possible to not see it correctly because it could be a dark area. They don't even realize it's a cliff. Well, that's what it's like in Israel. When at certain time periods, those cliffs can be very dangerous. They're the shadow of death. They're a dark valley. As that sun goes off on an angle, the sun is beginning to form clouds here, or shade, I should say, in the bottom of the wadi. As the time goes on, it gets darker and darker and darker during the later afternoon. So this literally is what David's talking about here. And as I mentioned before, in these wadis, they're very dangerous because this could be the source of floods. This could be the source of all kinds of situations. They're very, very difficult. But the shepherd knows exactly when these things are going to take place. He understands. So finding pathways in and out of the valley is a really big challenge. Imagine trying to take your sheep down into this valley because even as they try to wind their way down, find the right kind of a pathway, because they got to get from one side to the other, and there's no other way. They got to go through the valley, through this dark, dark valley, and come out of it again. They have to find the pathway, but on top of it, the predators lying in wait. Animals, like wolves, for example. They know, the wolves know that the shepherd are going to bring their sheep down in here, so they lie in wait. So it's a very, very dangerous place, extremely dangerous. They can lie in wait in caves, even many caves along these hillsides. And there were lions back in these days. They were even much greater threat than the wolves and other animals that were a big problem. The lambs were particularly vulnerable because they could easily break their legs and be in big, big trouble trying to get through these valleys. Now, this is a video I'm going to show you, actually of an area down by Jericho, but this is one of those
Flying
wadis,
along
just
the
kind
north
of
side of
look
the
at it
Wadi
again
Kelt,
here.
the camera provides a view of the Jordan Valley in the distance. On the right, near the exit of the canyon, is a prominent flat-topped peak that is the location of Kypros. This fort, named after Herod the Great's mother, was one of many Herod constructed to protect his kingdom from invasion. The fortress overlooked New Testament Jericho and guarded the Roman road from Jerusalem. Along the sides of the canyon can be seen channels that bring water from springs further west in the canyon down to the Jordan Valley. The gorge has biblical significance, for it is commonly believed that this is the valley of Achor, mentioned in Joshua chapter 7, verse 10. In this gorge, the man Achan was stoned because he disobeyed the order of the Lord not to keep items of value taken during the capture of Jericho.
Okay. By the way, as I mentioned before, these little videos I use from time to time are from an organization called Preserving Bible Times, used with permission. They're a really good organization to examine for background and context of the Bible. And I showed you that just to show you a little further this whole idea of these valleys and this idea of shepherds trying to move across something like that, which would be incredible. And David goes on, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Well, as we know, there are many predators. The greatest danger, of course, were the lions, as I mentioned. They could kill up to 10 sheep at a time. Um, in this verse from Peter, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. And I think this is a reference to this very idea of this great danger of in this case, the lion looking for sheep. In this case, he's referring to people, representative. Now, the shepherd, this is very well known, had, of course, the slings in David and Goliath, and we will look at that story at some point in the context of depth. These slings are pretty fascinating, how skillful these shepherds were with them. They could put those rocks in that little pouch, whirl it around their head, and get it to the point where they would release the one side, and that they could get the stones to travel, it's estimated, up to 120 miles an hour and hit a 6-inch target 100 feet away. So they were a pretty effective weapon against these predators. And they would also use them sometimes to redirect their sheep. They would try to hit a stone in front of or a rock in front of an area where a couple of sheep were going the wrong direction to kind of scare them back. So it was used to kind of guide them in that sense. But these, are, of course, are very famous. Now, the rod, the sling wasn't referred to in Psalm 23, but of course, David had slings. But the rod and staff were. So what was a rod? Well, the rod was really the major defensive weapon that shepherds had. This one particular one pictured here is a little bit longer than normal. Sometimes they were a little bit shorter than that, but on one end they would have a metal, and it would be either like nails or some kind of metal material that would be the weapon side that they would use to fight off predators. Okay, so this is called a rod. A reference in Psalms, you will break them with a rod of iron. So there'd be a lot of times iron on the one side. That would be reference to what that means. And in Revelation, states that a ruler will govern with a rod of iron. This is all references back to this shepherd image of a rod. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock. I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair and I struck it and killed it. He's referring to this whole idea, how this was back when he was, of course, younger, how he had perfected this idea of saving his sheep, protecting his sheep, and using a rod. Now, the rod was not only used as a weapon, sometimes it was used to examine sheep, to separate the wool, to examine the skin, and even to maybe prod off one sheep from bowling another sheep, which would happen sometimes. The rod was also used to count sheep. Now, this is an old picture. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can see the rod. He's holding out the rod there, and he's counting the sheep as they come back into this little home area they're living in. And the home area they're living in, I'm going to be examining much closer in the next teaching, which will be the Good Shepherd. The next teaching, it's called a sheepfold. And it looks something like this. This is like an ideal sheepfold that they would bring their sheep into at night. They would be looking for caves, which are pretty plentiful in the wilderness area. And then the shepherds would pile up stones to make like a narrow entry. And then he would sleep at that entry to protect the sheep. That's called a sheepfold. And they're very significant in the Bible. They're referred to very often, as we'll see. Now, this sheepfold is made just out of sticks, so apparently there weren't any stones available. But notice it does have this one entry where the shepherd would sleep at night to protect his sheep. This is a more fancy one made out of stone, and again, you have that one entry point. These are called sheepfolds. So the staff is longer, and of course had that crooked end. and many, many uses, and you are very familiar with the staff, I'm sure. Often used to rescue a fallen sheep, especially when it fell into rocks or fell down into a cliff area. It just had many, many uses. And of course, in the Bible, I should say in pictures and imagery, we picture Jesus with this shepherd's staff all the time also, because it's probably the number one thing we associate with shepherds. Sheep can easily fall and roll over. They don't have great balance sometimes. When this happens, the blood can drain from their legs, making it very hard to stand. Now, this is referred to as a cast down sheep. And this is actually referred to in the Bible. That's literally what it is. When a sheep falls over and its circulation kind of loses circulation in its legs, and it can't move, it can't get back up. This whole idea of he restoreth my soul, he restoreth. The shepherd takes time to restore the strength of that animal when it falls. So in other words, what the shepherd has to do is to get that sheep upright again, and then it will massage its legs to restore it back to its strength. It's going to get it back so it can walk again. Apart from that, it'd be vulnerable and it would die. It could be easily taken down by a predator at that point. So this whole idea of restoring the sheep, literally this is one example of trying to keep the sheep in the right kind of conditions so they can continue to follow the shepherd. And here's a verse referring to that, and this is literally what it looks like when a sheep falls over and they can't get back up. Why art thou cast down, O my soul? And why art thou disquieted in me? Hope thou in God, for I shall yet praise him for the help of his countenance. So this is literally a reference to this idea of being cast down. It's a reference, it's referring to this idea of a cast down sheep that only the shepherd can help at that point. He needs to nurse it back, to get it back, get its strength back, its circulation back, so it can stand and walk and follow him again. Now, the focus kind of changes here at the end of the 23rd Psalm, in the last couple parts of it. The next part, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Okay, so this seems to be a little different idea here, preparing a table. And we're picturing a wilderness, so what does this mean? In Israel, and I have mentioned this before, but hospitality was central. Preparing a table means to prepare a meal in the Bible. Hosting large meals with more food than any of the visitors could eat was very significant. It was a demonstration of wealth. The host normally does not prepare, but women, workers, or servants. So this whole idea of preparing a table is a meal, and it's going to be a great big meal in this case. Preparing a table is, again, preparing the meal. And here's a reference in Proverbs. She has prepared her meat and mixed her wine. She has also set her table. So that's this idea of preparing this meal, this big feast, which is so significant. That'd be a sign of hospitality, and a sign of wealth too in the Bible, preparing a very large meal. Now, normally women and servants prepare the meal, but in this case, God's preparing the meal. God himself is going to prepare this meal. So this is very significant. This is very different than the normal custom, putting this back in context. And now, what does he mean by in the presence of my enemies? What does that mean? What's the background to that idea, David writing? Well, here's a couple examples from the New Testament of this, preparing a meal in the presence of enemies. You remember this story, the prodigal son. And if you haven't watched this, I would encourage you to go back and watch it. It's back a few different lessons before this one, but you can find it. But this whole idea, when the father had this costly love, regardless of who was watching, what this means is the father had been watching every day for his prodigal son to one day come back. And once he saw him, he ran. He disgraced himself, because that was disgraceful for an older person to do. But he did. He didn't care. And he ran out to hug his son to kind of protect him from the anger of the town, because the son had disgraced the entire town too. So that's what he did. But then there's going to be a meal afterwards. And in that meal, they're going to have this whole community is going to come. If you remember, they used a fattened calf, not a lamb. The calf would be to bring all the people of the town in. Well, these people in the town gladly came to the meal and they celebrated with the father for his great love for his son. But they themselves probably didn't love the son at all because he had disgraced the village. If you remember back in that lesson I showed you this idea of Kazaza ceremony, they had literally disowned him because of what he had done to his father. So this really would be a meal in the presence of enemies, an example of that. Another one would be this. This would be Zacchaeus. There's so many times that Jesus did things like this. These meals were in the presence of enemies, but he didn't care because he wanted to show the worth of that individual. He wanted to show, and the accusation was he has gone to be the guest of a man who's a sinner. Of course, Zacchaeus they were talking about, and Jesus continually did this, demonstrated costly love in the presence of enemies, because he wanted to show everyone is made in the image of God. Everyone has ultimate worth. Now, thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Okay? One of the reasons they did this with sheep was to actually protect them because oil on the heads of sheep had a tendency to nose around smelling things. And it was a big problem. They stuck their nose in a snake hole, obviously, or some other dangerous creature. But oil on the head of a sheep could help protect them since the smell is offensive to other animals. In addition to this, it helped to heal the sheep from any head cuts that they might sustain. So that was one kind of a practical idea of this. But of course, we also know an ancient custom of hospitality and respect shown was to an esteemed dinner guest was for the host to anoint the invitee's head with oil. The oil was mixed with fragrant perfumes very often to refresh and soothe weary travelers. So this was something that was done out of hospitality. In Psalms 23:5, David said to the Lord, "You anoint my head with oil," because he regarded himself as the Lord's special guest. See, David had been invited to dine now and forever at the Lord's table and to receive his favorable anointing. And he knew that not a woman or a servant, but the Lord himself is going to anoint him with oil. And to him, this was amazing. This was so incredible that this was going on. And this psalm of praise, you can see why when David is just thinking about things like this are so amazing to him. If you remember this incident in the New Testament when Jesus was invited to the home of a Pharisee, and the Pharisee did not anoint his head with oil, but this woman who was described as a woman who had been sinning, anointed his feet with oil. She spent really all she had for this oil to anoint his feet. And Jesus said, "You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume and oil on my feet. And then surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life." Now, goodness is the word tov. Mercy is the word hesed, which are very important Hebraic words. David lived his life with all of his failures and fears, of course, what he had done. But God followed him, giving him what he did not deserve. In spite of everything, David had lots of failures, like we all do. In spite of all that, goodness and mercy are going to follow him all the days of his life. And he was just like amazed by this. Now, the idea of following, okay, just to go back on that, follow me, it means something even more. If we go back in the shepherd imagery here, to follow, normally the shepherd, of course, was the one who led, and then they'd often have an under shepherd, or sometimes they'd actually use like a dog even, in the back of the pack to follow, in case something tried to sneak up on that last sheep or lamb. Often a wolf or a lion would follow the sheep when they, wherever they were going on their way back to the sheepfold. The shepherd would often use an assistant, sometimes a dog, to follow right behind the sheep to protect them. So this is this idea of following him. This love and mercy is following David to protect him, his from the back here, even at that point this idea of following. So that image, just to try to bring this out, that's what David, I believe, is thinking about here at this point. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Well, David understood his dwelling would be forever with God. And of course, in the book of Revelations, we have this verse in 21:3. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with men, with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God forever." This dwelling forever. Now, using sheep imagery, God provided a plan of ultimate protection from Satan's designs to try to destroy us, to try to destroy our lives and to bring us into hell. And what was that? What's this imagery? Going back to this story that we looked at a few weeks ago, when Abraham had followed God's direction in taking his son Isaac up to Mount Moriah, and thought he was going to have to sacrifice his son. Of course, God stopped him. He wasn't going to have that done. He was checking for his obedience. And at that point, Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." So here we have, again, this image of a ram, a male lamb, is what this is. That's what God is going to provide. That's going to be his ultimate protection. Of course, it was caught by his horns, and the horns become the symbol, become the shofar, the symbol of redemption. On this mountain, God will provide a male lamb, and that male lamb, of course, would be somehow Abraham at that time understood. Jesus said, "Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day." He saw it and he was glad. He knew that God is going to provide this ultimate sacrifice. And I think it's very possible, this is just, I'm not sure, but based on what we know about David, it's very possible that he too somehow knew that God is going to provide this ultimate protection, this ultimate sacrifice. And it's going to involve this idea of lamb imagery again. It's going to come back to that ultimately. And of course, because of this, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Well, thank you for watching this version number 11 of our contextual Bible study, Psalm 23. Shalom.